Thanks for joining this episode of the Number 86 Lecture Series, where we discuss basic principles and applications of tort law along with landmark cases. Today's episode features Gregory Dolin, who is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore, where he teaches torts, contracts, property, intellectual property, federal courts, and constitutional law. As always, the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker.
Professor Dolin, thanks for joining us today. Let's start with the basics. What knowledge do students typically have about tort law when they first enter your classroom? And why are students required to take torts classes?
Students come in, some of them come in with lots of knowledge because they come in from a lawyer family, or they may have worked in a law firm as paralegals or whatnot. And some come in with no knowledge whatsoever, and some come in even worse with incorrect knowledge. So because some of them know about tort law from, media reporting, which sometimes is sensationalized. So I think everybody sort of knows that tort is about the study of injury and compensation for the injury, but they most likely don't know what kind of injuries are compensable, are there limits, right? Where, who do you sue and who can't you sue? In my law school, both the one that I attended and the one where I teach torts is a first semester course. I know schools where it's second semester. I know schools where it's both semesters. I don't think I know any schools where it's optional. I actually always ask students, one of the first questions I ask them, because torts is, in my school, first semester, and sometimes it happens, it's the first day of courses, because, we run usually courses Monday through Friday, and sometimes torts design on Monday. And sometimes if it's an early day, sometimes maybe not only a first semester, first day, but maybe literally the first course that they have. And so they get their first question oftentimes from me, and I ask them, kind of, why are you here? And so besides the fact that the dean told you have to be because you need that to graduate, I ask them, how many of you plan to be personal injury attorneys? And actually a few hands go up. Most people don't, at least initially, come into school thinking that that's what they're going to do. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but maybe because they don't know what they're going to do, but actually not that many hands go up. And so I ask, well, why are you here? Why do you think this course is being taught to you? And eventually we get to this answer that torts, unlike almost any other first-year course, is really perhaps the only place where common law is still king.
That's interesting. How does tort law's basis in common law make it unique compared to other first-year courses?
There's a lot of common law and property, but we also have a lot of statutory law and property. In contracts, of course, we have Uniform Commercial Code, which is at least half of contracts law. In constitutional law, of course, we have the Constitution. In criminal law, of course, we have a Uniform Criminal Code. Or tort law, there's very, very few statutes. And it is really about reasoning by analogy and learning, as this old saying goes, law schools don't teach you how to be a lawyer, they teach you how to think like a lawyer. And so what torts does, and which is why if I were king of the universe or king of all law schools and deciding how to structure a curriculum, I would always keep it at a first semester course. Because I think what tort does is help students, while it may not directly relate to property, it may not directly relate to common law, but it helps students understand how courts work, how they're reasoned by analogy, how there's an evolution of theories.
Could you give us an example of how tort law has evolved historically in the common law?
So for example, for a long time, before somewhere around 19th or so century, there was really no concept of negligence. It was mostly all kind of strict liability. Basically, look, you injure somebody, you pay. That's it. As technology evolved, as we understood that, look, you can be very, very careful in operating your technology. And yet, so the first case I teach on negligence is a case where a person operates a boiler on his property somewhere in the early 19th century. And by all accounts, that person is very careful. He does everything right. He makes sure that the pressure doesn't go beyond what's supposed to go to. And yet, new technology, the boiler explodes and flying shrapnel lands on a neighboring yard, causing some sort of damage. And a neighbor says, well, it's your boiler, right? So you damaged my yard, so you ought to pay for me. And the court says no, because she took all due care. And sometimes bad things happen. And the court said that's okay because the entire society benefits from having boilers. It's nice to take a hot shower, right? It's nice to be able to warm yourself up in the winter without having to go into the forest and chop wood. And so the course has, again, and this goes back to this idea of cost-benefit and internalizing your costs and benefits. Saying, look, entire society benefits from having this new technology. Unfortunately, part of the new technology comes with the territory that sometimes somebody will randomly be injured. But that's a very historical development, right? And so that's why I think tort doesn't directly relate to property or necessarily contracts or crim law, but it does help people kind of put their minds into the frame of thinking like a lawyer and why we're getting from point A to point B.
You mentioned starting your class with a classic case. Could you tell us about that and why it's a good introduction to tort law?
So I started a class with a very classic case that's taught in most law schools. I started class with Vosburgh versus Putney. It's a classic battery case, and it seems like a very, very easy case, but students do oftentimes struggle with it because it seems that a lot of what happened was unintentional. And the basic facts of the case are, so this happened in mid-19th century Wisconsin. This happened in a one-room school in the middle of winter. Kids were playing at a recess, and then recess was over. Teacher called the class to order, and then one kid tapped the other kid on a foot with his toe. By all accounts, it was a slight tap. It was not like a kick. He was not trying to beat him up. Maybe he was trying to get his attention to pass him a note or anything. But something was wrong with the person who was hit. He apparently had a prior injury, and so a few seconds later, he just starts screaming in pain. He gets sent home. He has to have like 2 surgeries. Doctors think that he'll lose his leg. Fast forwarding several decades later, it turns out things were fine. He lived a perfectly normal and healthy life. The only limitation was he wore a leather leg brace for the rest of his life. But got married, had kids, actually managed to leave a good amount of money to his family. But at the time, it was a kind of this drastic thing came out from a light tap on a foot. And like I said, it's an easy case in a sense, like there's not complicated statutory law, it's just one kid hitting another. And the question is this battery? And the rule is very simple. Any unconsented to touch is battery. And this touch was unconsented precisely because the teacher has called the class to order, and pupils were supposed to sit, quietly listen to the teacher, and instead, they weren't. The reason students struggle with it is because the action causing the injury and the amount of injury is so disproportionate. Students oftentimes struggle like, well, why should, when all I wanted to do is tap this person's foot to get his attention. Boys do this in class all the time, kind of boys will be boys thing. Why should he pay this crazy amounts of money for this entirely unforeseen injury? And so we spent actually a whole day talking about this, whether this makes sense. So that's kind of how I start teaching torts.
How do you structure the rest of your course after covering that initial battery case? What other types of torts do you teach, and do you cover the defense justifications?
So I spent about maybe 3 or so weeks doing intentional torts. So I start out with battery, then I move on to assault, which is just like battery, except the touch is not complete. So that's kind of when you come and shake your fist into somebody's face, saying, I'm about to hit you, but you never do. So you create an apprehension of touch. We talk a little bit about intentional infliction of emotional distress, which I find to be not a difficult tort to teach, but very difficult for students to understand insofar as they love this tort. They think that, finally somebody takes into account our feelings and how we feel. But then they think that almost anything that goes wrong in a world of torts, you can shoehorn in one way or another into intentional infliction of emotional distress. So, I give an exam, says like there's a car accident and somebody's grievously injured. So it's like, well, and also intentional infliction of emotional distress because how dare you drive the car so recklessly? And it's hard to wean them off of it saying, no, it's a very actually narrow tort. It's intentional. It's about intentionally causing that distress. Going, for example, to somebody's house and saying, your loved one is dead in a gruesome accident. Thinking that's a practical joke, but, causing, obviously, the person to suffer significant emotional damage from such fake news. So that's what I do for the first 3 weeks. So I do assault, I do battery, I do IIED, I do trespass, and then I do some defenses to those torts. So for example, justification defense, defense of property, defense of necessity. So can you trespass on somebody else's land if, for example, you're trying to save your life or life of others? Can you, for example, set up spring guns if you know your property is constantly being robbed? And so can you set up basically deadly traps for the unwary? And then I move on to kind of spend the rest of the semester, about 2/3 of it, on negligence. And sometimes if we have time in the last couple of classes, we get to strict liability, although that hasn't happened in a while.
What would you say are the primary goals of tort law? What is it trying to accomplish?
So there are different goals of tort law, and it oftentimes depends on who you ask and different philosophies of tort law. But broadly speaking, one is to compensate the victim, to try to put the victim in as good of a position he was in prior to the injury happening. So, you get into a car accident, somebody smashes up your car, that costs you, $10,000 to repair it. So it's the person who rammed into you ought to pay you the money. The other goal of tort law is deterrence, in similar to criminal law, right? So, for example, if you force the person who rammed into your car to pay the money, maybe next time they'll be more careful, as well as people in society generally will know, hey, if you drive recklessly, you'll have a higher chance of getting into an accident, which means I may have to pay money out of pocket, and generally we want to avoid doing that, so maybe I will not drive as recklessly. The third goal of tort law is kind of this idea that it's essentially it's wealth redistribution, but not in any sort of socialist way, but in a way that if you engage in particular activity, you usually have some benefit from it. And whether it's you're selling things, whether you're driving around because you just enjoy driving around, or whatever it is that you do, generally you do these things because you derive some benefit from it. And if you do, the idea is you should also bear whatever cost that activity has as well, right? So that you don't externalize costs to others while keeping benefits to yourself. So in that sense, we redistribute your wealth in a way to balance, basically to make you bear the cost as well as benefits of the activity. Efficiency is another goal of tort law, right? So again, this idea that if it becomes too expensive for you to drive in a particular way, if it becomes too expensive because the cost to society are very high in engaging in a particular activity, you might want to stop doing that or do it in a different way. So, and that is more economically efficient. So there's a variety of goals of tort law. There's some individuals argue that pure kind of morality, right? So basically behaving in a right way is a goal of tort law. So and oftentimes in any given case, all of those goals might point in the same directions, and because of all of these goals, the plaintiff should win or lose. And sometimes they point in different directions, and judges and juries have to weigh which one ought to predominate in any given case.
That's a helpful, comprehensive overview. Do you find torts an enjoyable subject to teach? Are there any specific techniques to make the material more relatable to students?
I think torts is in many ways the most fun course, certainly I think the most fun out of 1L courses. As I call it, again, usually on the first day of class, I tell students, torts is a study of human foibles. It's a study of oftentimes funny, silly stories. Yes, sometimes they do, unfortunately, have tragic consequences, but oftentimes they're just kind of stupid things that people do. And, we all have done stupid things in our lives, and hopefully eventually we learn to laugh about them. And that's what torts is. I often show my students this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes, where it's a strip where Calvin is sitting there watching TV and eating a bowl of cereal and turns to Hobbes and says, this is what I love about Sunday: sugar, TV, and fallen anvils. Because he's watching that cartoon. And so that's what torts is. And I think he also says, idiots and fallen anvils. That's oftentimes what torts is. And yes, we do have to remember that there are injured parties and there are actually real people sometimes being hurt. But nevertheless, it's, and also torts is something that most of us have experienced. Most of us have been either in a car accident, and most of us have, tripped and fallen somewhere, or, most of us have done something that we probably should not have done, whether somebody was injured by that or not. So I think if somebody's not excited by torts, I have then questions whether they're in the right place. Now, in terms of what do I try to do, I usually try to relate it to tell them, like, look, this is not just dry law books. This happens in real life. I tell them the story about how I was pushed off a moving train. I tell them a story about how, like, our house nearly caught fire. I tell them a story, so I teach this, for example, a case called Andrews versus United Airlines, written by then Judge Kaczynski, where the plane lands and somebody reaches into the overhead bin, reaches for a suitcase, and the suitcase falls and injures a passenger. And the lawsuit is like, well, United should have done more to prevent it. And United says, like, what do you mean? We told you items could have shifted. Which Judge Kaczynski says, well, number one, great, you did, but nobody knows how they've shifted until they actually opened up the baggage compartment. By that point, it may be too late. And two, it ultimately says, look, we're not saying United did something right or wrong, but it's a question for the jury whether more could have been done. When I teach this case, I tell them how I was once on a flight from Tel Aviv to New York, and I was sitting in an aisle seat, and this mother was reaching over my head to take out a suitcase because her child needed something, and she dropped a suitcase right on my head. And the mother didn't speak any English, and so all she did is tap me on the shoulder, said, "You'll be fine," and then moved on. And so I tried to relate to these humorous stories. Luckily, I was fine. She was right. But I try to relate these stories to what has happened to me, what has happened to my family, what, or as students, what similar something like that happened to them. Sometimes they volunteer those stories. And, so I try to relate to kind of to everyday life. But at some point, right, if that kind of doesn't speak to you, then it doesn't speak to you. I get it. But I teach a number of 1L courses. I teach torts, I teach contracts, I teach property, and I love all of them for different reasons. But I think torts is the most fun to teach. I think torts is the most fun to learn.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the number 86 lecture series on tort law. The spirit of debate of our founding fathers animates all of the number 86 content, encouraging discussion and critical reflection relative to how each subject is widely understood and taught in law schools and among law students. Subscribe to the number 86 lecture series on your favorite podcast platform to have each episode delivered the moment it's released. You can also go to number86.fedsoc.org for lectures and videos on federalism, contracts, jurisprudence, and more. Thanks for listening. See you in class.